Hey, what's up guys? So welcome back to the shop. Off camera, I went ahead and got this glued up, but I still want to show you that process. So we're just going to move to a different order, another Huginn, and I'll show you how I do it. All right, first things first, I need to know where I'm going to be cutting and grinding for these individual scales. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a metal scribe to get a nice thin outline around the tang of the knife. And then I'm going to go ahead and clamp it so that I can drill the holes prior to cutting. Now, straight up, there are many ways to do this. I'm sure the way that I do it isn't the best way that you can do it, but this is the way I'm currently doing it. I tend to try and have one way to do things so that I don't have to, think about what kind of knife is this? Is this the way that I need to glue it up? Because normally with a tapered tang, I do it this way because you have to drill the holes per each scale separately for the holes to line up with a tapered tang. This isn't a tapered tang, but like I said, I like to do everything kind of the same so that it's just a repeatable process for no matter what I'm doing. Also, I save a lot of material doing it this way because there are some people that will just stack a set of scales on top of each other and drill through both so that the lines will line up no matter what. But you're losing a lot of material and that way. And this is such a small knife when it comes to the width of the tang that it wouldn't be smart to waste that much material if I don't have to. And so you notice I'm using a metal bandsaw to cut the micarta, and that is because normal wood bandsaws or the scroll saw that I have that I use to cut my wood, the blades just get eaten up by this material, so I got to use metal bandsaw blades. And what I'll do is with any other extra material that I have from that specific scale, I'll throw into where all my materials are so I can use that as a spacer or something later. And then once I'm ready to start grinding, I'll use a square to make sure that I got a nice 90-degree angle with my work rest and the grinder itself. Then I'll go ahead and grind all the excess material away down to that line that I scribed with that metal scribe. And just to make clear, just in case it wasn't, the reason why I made sure that the platen was square to the work rest is as I'm grinding this, the worst thing I could do, especially if I'm going to try and get as close to that scribe line as possible, is grind the profile of those scales out and have it the actual the top, the outside of the scale be angled, because once I actually put it on the knife, it might actually be it might not cover the entire tang because of the taper that was ground into the profile of the scale. Now that problem can actually get a lot worse if you don't have your platen and work rest square with what I'm about to do. So now I'm pinning them together because there are going to be areas on these scales that I won't be able to actually grind and make sure they're even with each other once they're on the knife. So I'm doing that now. So once they're pinned together, the holes are aligned, and this is where the hole it needs to be square comes extremely important, because if they're not square and I throw them on the knife, the front of the left scale may be one place, and then if it's, like I said, it was ground at like a taper or an angle, once it's on the knife, then that second scale is not going to match up to that other one, and it's going to look terrible. Ask me how I know that. Now look at the scales real quick. You see how they're kind of dirty looking? It's because I took them to the grinder and I roughed them up, and that's extremely important when you're going to epoxy some scales onto a knife, is to ensure that both the knife itself is roughed up as well as the scales. That's going to create more surface area for the epoxy to actually grip onto the scales and hold on to the tang of the knife. So not all epoxies are created equal, and the epoxies that I like to use is called G-Flex. It is a marine grade epoxy, which means that they use them on boats. This stuff is absolutely insanely strong, but it's not the only epoxy I use. I stick with West Systems, which is what G-Flex is from, but I also use the 5-minute version of this epoxy. So just in case I need to finish the knife that day or something, I'll use G5, as you can see. The issue with this is it says it's 5-minute epoxy, but it's more like 1.5 or 2-minute epoxy. So your preparation has to be on point. And if it's not, you're in for a real rough time and most likely having to clean up everything and do it all over again. But unless it's absolutely necessary, I use the 24-hour epoxy. And so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. So I'll put a quarter size of each portion of the epoxy. And then what I do is I actually darken it with Alumilite black dye. And the reason for this is no matter how flat you have your stuff, it is done by hand. So they're gonna be like little micro gaps that are like almost invisible to the eye, but they're there. And so what I do is I typically will be using, black handle material or dark handle material, and black epoxy will fill those micro gaps and make the knife look seamless. The awesome thing too is it acts as an indicator to let you know that your epoxy is ready to be used, because you don't want to use it unless it's fully mixed up. And when it's all an even color black, you can use it. And so I'll throw it liberally on my scales so that it'll actually squeeze out when I clamp the scales to the knife itself. And this is important because it's the squeeze out that's going to be filling in all those micro gaps. Now, one of the things I always ensure that I do as well once I have the epoxy on the scales is I'll dip the pins in the epoxy as well. Even though it looks as though epoxy is getting into those holes, I always just want to be sure that the pins are actually going to be helping the knife stay together instead of just being a visual thing. So I always just make sure that they're coated in epoxy so that that whole area within those holes has epoxy going through it. Also, one of the things I didn't do here that I normally do is you can see me struggling a little bit to get those pins inside the holes. And the way to avoid that is just have the pins sticking out of the scale just a little bit, maybe like 1/8 of an inch. And you can see that's exactly what I do here. I hammer those pins through the scale and the tang, and they're sticking out just 1/8 of an inch. And that just makes it way easier for everything to line up. And then of course what you want to do is you want to have the pins go all the way through, but this is going to leave some excess pin. Now you can measure it if you like, in order to not waste any pin material like I'm about to, but a lot of the times I'm trying to move quickly, and so I overcut the pins just to ensure that I have enough for the scales. So now I grind off the excess pin material so that it doesn't impede the clamping. Now, something that is a common mistake with new knife makers that I got to hit on is not over clamping. Like I said, you want that squeeze out so that you can fill those micro gaps, but you don't want to squeeze out too much of the epoxy. You actually want epoxy, between the tang and the handle material so that it'll actually stay. If you squeeze it all out, you're not going to have a really strong bond, and that can cause issues later. So what I'm holding right here is some stuff called Goof Off, and it gets rid of adhesive. And so there are areas, in front of the knife and below the swedge, areas that you can't get to once it's glued up, that you want to ensure that there is no excess epoxy. You want to get all of it. All right, so now you guys saw the glue up process. Now let's go ahead and move back to the original one that we were working on in the beginning, and now I'll show you the sculpting. So now we're going to get rid of all the excess material above and below the tang. Also, while I'm grinding, I'm ensuring that I'm not tipping the knife, that I'm keeping it nice and flat on that work rest, which is why I go a lot slower during this process than you would probably think that you need to. And that's just making sure that I'm not creating any sort of weird angle, within that flat that's gonna, cause me issues later. Then one of the things that I always make sure that I do is as I go up in the grits, I'm obviously changing the belts. The lower grit belts are a lot thicker than the higher grit belts. So I got to check that square every single time I change the belt to a different grit, because if there's a little bit of deviation in the squareness of the platen and the work rest that I didn't notice with the thicker belt, and it didn't really have that much of an issue or cause much of an issue, that issue will amplify, or that deviation will amplify with the thinner belts. Also, the reason why I go up the grits is because that's going to make my life way easier once I actually start hand sanding the blade. Now, one of the issues that I run into with the way that I grind the profile of the knife, you know, with the scales, is I have a lot of chop because I'm using the edge of the belt to do like rounded areas. So they're not perfectly round. So that's why I move over to my Dremel, and then I'll actually ensure that it's nice, round and smooth. So now I'm getting rid of that excess material from behind the tang and inside the ring. And one of the things that I also need to make sure that I do is break those edges. There's a lot of edges within that ring that can, you know, catch your finger, be uncomfortable, cause hot spots. So I just ensure that I get rid of all those areas that may cause a hot spot later or catch on your glove or kit or anything like that, so it's nice and rounded. With sculpting the handle, I try and use techniques that will allow me to keep everything nice, straight, and even. And I'll do one side, and then I'll move on to the next side, and I'll just compare as I go. And before moving to the next portion of the sculpting, I want to make sure everything is nice and symmetrical. Now with this is it's not gonna be perfect because of the method that I'm using for the grinding. Like I said, using the edge of the platen like that doesn't create a smooth surface, creates tons of notches, and so that'll get smoothed out with hand sanding. With the finger groove, as you can see, I use the Dremel to do that. I've tried using small wheel attachments and things like that, and it just does not work as well. I don't have as much control, and so I do it with the Dremel. Now, this is where I will taper the front of the handle, which is gonna get rid of some of that finger groove. So after I ensure that this is nice and symmetrical and has a good taper, then I'll go back with the Dremel and just re-sculpt that finger groove. And then I just break all the sharp corners, giving them small angles so I know that these aren't things that are gonna catch on your kit or any part of your clothing or cause a hot spot. And so now I'm hand sanding, and my goal with hand sanding is not to take the tang to a super high finish. I take it to about 300 grit, and then I go to the sandblaster. This is one of those things that allows me to have an even finish throughout the blade, and it saves me time, which is why I can offer this knife for the price that I do. My customs are much higher finishes, and obviously they have a price that coincides with that. Also, another really cool thing about sandblasting is it gets rid of all the softer fibers in the wood. So it actually gives it a lot more texture because it's getting rid of some of it. So if you look at the top of the knife right here, you're gonna see nice little bits of texture, little bits of the wood, the softer wood that's gone. So it gives it more character, adds almost a little bit of gripping to it, and it just looks really cool. Now that it's sandblasted, I'm gonna blacken it with super blue. And once I blacken the tang and the ring, I won't actually have to touch that again. It'll be completely done. And then I'll do the finishing hand sanding on all the rest of the facets. Now what I like to do is I like to take 120, and this is where I tighten everything up. This is where I make sure that everything is symmetrical and also that all the facets are sharp. Once I'm comfortable with the symmetry and the sharpness of all the facets, then that's when I start taking it up all the grits, and I'll go from 120 to 300 to 600, and then we'll hit the buffer. Those of you that have a buffer know that that's like the most dangerous tool in the shop, especially with knives. I don't ever buff blades. I don't do mirror polishes, but I buff handles. But even so, I'm still very careful about this. I'll cover the knife, and just go slow. I go at a very low speed, so if it does pull the knife from my hand, it's not flinging it like a million miles an hour. But this is what the finished handle looks like. Now it's time to give the blade an edge. So I use the Wicked Edge Pro. This is not a cheap piece of equipment. It was almost $1,000. But the reason why I like to sharpen my blades with it and not just use my grinder or even stones, I like the fact that it holds it in place and lets me actually give the knife like a very specific angle. I do this for the customer, not for myself. I could easily get the same result as far as sharpness with my grinder, but I don't do that because what I want is for people to be able to maintain and resharpen their blades themselves. And I feel that being able to tell the client the exact angle it was sharpened to allows them to do that. And that's pretty much it. That's how I make the Huginn. Now check this out, finished product.